For this lesson, you need your work text pages, the favorite sport survey page, some colored pencils. You actually need 5 different colors. And then you should also have some scratch paper. Now let's get right into our practice and review. Last time you interpreted a chart. This time let's look at a bar graph. Now this bar graph shows donut sales throughout the week. So get ready to answer some questions. Take a few seconds and study the bar graph carefully so you'll be ready to answer the questions. All right, the first question is, on which day of the week were the most donuts sold? On which day of the week were the most donuts sold? That's Wednesday, the tallest bar. It goes up to 30. So that's 30 donuts that were sold on that day. Now, on what day were the fewest donuts sold? Well, that's Thursday, the smallest bar. It only goes to 10. Now, beginning with the day on which the fewest donuts were sold, I want you to order the days of the week according to the number of donuts sold each day. So write down a list with the days. The day with the fewest donuts is first, and then write the rest of them in order of the number of donuts sold. So basically least to greatest. Probably need to pause the lesson to write all those down. And your list should be Thursday, Friday, Tuesday, Monday, and then Wednesday. Now, 12 donuts equal 1 dozen. So on which days were more than 1 dozen donuts sold? On which days were more than 1 dozen donuts sold? Well, that would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. Thursday was the only day that fewer than a dozen were sold. There were only 10 sold on Thursday. We need at least 12 to be a dozen. Now, on which days were more than 2 dozen donuts sold? More than 2 dozen donuts. That would be Monday and Wednesday. 2 dozen donuts is 24 donuts. 12 times 2 is 24. So Monday and Wednesday are the only days where more than 2 dozen donuts were sold. Did you answer all those correctly? I hope so. Now the next thing we're going to do is a fact review. Now take a look at the favorite sport survey page. We're told that 100 students were asked what sport is their favorite. And the 100 squares that you see there at the bottom of the page represent the 100 students who were asked what sport is their favorite. Now I want you to fill in the table at the top of the page and color in the grid at the bottom as we work through this. So, how many students chose basketball as their favorite sport? Well, 40 chose basketball. And what is the ratio of students who chose basketball as their favorite sport to the total students? Well, that's 40 to 100. 40 chose basketball, there's 100 students that were asked total. Now, is this ratio a part to whole, or a whole to part ratio? It's a part to whole. 40 is a part and 100 is the whole. Remember, a part to whole comparison shows a fractional relationship, a part compared to a whole like a fraction. So we can say that 40/100ths of the students chose basketball as their favorite sport, because writing that ratio in fraction form is like a fraction, so 40/100ths. Now, how can we use the grid to represent the ratio of students who chose basketball? Well, we can color 40 of the 100 squares all the same color, like this. So color 40 squares on your page in one color. Pause the lesson to do that coloring. Now, what is the ratio of students who chose baseball as their favorite sport? Well, that's 5/100, or 5/100ths, 5/100ths. So there's our ratio in fraction form. And then how can we use the grid to show the number of students who chose baseball? We can do that by coloring 5 squares. So pick another color and shade in 5 squares. All right. Now, what is the ratio of students who chose football as their favorite sport? That's 20/100, or if we write that in fraction form, 20/100ths. All right, now let's show that on the grid. So we need to pick a different color and color in 20 squares. All right, so make sure that you pick a third color and shade in 20 squares for the students who chose football. All right, what is the ratio of students who chose soccer as their favorite sport? That's 25/100, or 25/100ths, we can say. So what should we do with our grid this time? We should color 25 squares. So choose another color and shade in 25 squares. And then, what is the ratio of students who chose swimming as their favorite sport? Well, that's 10/100, or we could say 10/100ths. Or you can also say 10/100ths. So let's show that on the grid now. We need to color 10 squares. So pick another color and shade in 10 squares this time. Now notice that now we have all of the squares colored and 100% of the survey responses are shown on it. Now that word I just said, percent, means by the 100, or we could say out of 100, or per 100. And the percent sign can be used to represent a ratio or a fraction in which the second term is 100. So, since 40 out of 100 students chose basketball as their favorite sport, we can say that 40% of the students chose basketball as their favorite sport. Since 5 out of 100 students chose baseball as their favorite sport, we could say that 5% chose baseball. Since 20 out of 100 chose football as their favorite sport, we can say that 20% chose football as their favorite sport. Since 25 out of 100 students chose soccer as their favorite sport, we can say that 25% chose soccer. And then since 10 out of 100 students chose swimming as their favorite sport, we can say that 10% chose swimming. Now, do you think that all percents would be written as a part to whole ratio? Yes, why? Because a percent is a part out of 100. A percent and a ratio or fraction with 100 as the second term describe the same relationship. Now look back at your page. Remember, 40% of the students chose basketball as their favorite sport. Now how can we rename the fraction 40/100ths into lowest terms? Well, we can divide both terms by the greatest common factor. In this case, the greatest common factor is 20. Or we could also divide both terms by another common factor. It doesn't have to be the greatest one, but we'd have to do that, keep dividing until the only common factor is 1. So let's divide by the greatest common factor. 40 divided by 20 equals 2, and 100 divided by 20 equals 5. So that's 2/5 of the students that chose basketball. And 2/5 is in lowest terms. Right? So For basketball, there were 40 students that chose it. That's 40% because it was 40 out of 100, and 40 100ths in lowest terms is 2/5. Now, what percent of the students prefers baseball? 5%. And what fraction of the students prefers baseball? 5 100ths. Or, what would that fraction be in lowest terms? Well, the GCF of 5 and 100 is 5, so we can divide 5 by 5, and that's 1. Then we divide 100 by 5, and that's 20. So that's 1/20th of the students that prefer baseball. Now, what percent of the students prefers football? 20%. What fraction of the students prefers football? 20 100ths, which in lowest terms is what? Well, divide both 20 and 100 by 20. 20 divided by 20 equals 1. 100 divided by 20 equals 5. So that's 1/5 of the students for football. Now, what percent of the students prefers soccer? 25%. What fraction of the students prefers soccer? 25 100ths, or what is that in lowest terms? 1/4. Because 25 divided by 25 is 1, and 100 divided by 25 is 4. And then what percent of the students prefer swimming? 10%. What fraction prefers swimming? 10 100ths. And then what is that fraction in lowest terms? Well, divide both of those numbers by 10 and you get 1/10. So 1/10 of the students chose swimming. Now let's look at some more percents and practice writing them as ratios in fraction form in lowest terms. So here we have 13%. What is the ratio going to look like in fraction form? The ratio that will be equivalent to 13%. Well, remember, with percents, the ratio will always have 100 as the second term. So this will be 13 100ths. And is that in lowest terms? Yes, it is. 13 and 100 have no factors in common greater than 1, so it's already in lowest terms. Next, we have 30%. Let's put this in ratio form as a fraction. So what will that look like? Be 30 100ths. Is that in lowest terms? No, both 30 and 100 can be divided by 10. 30 divided by 10 is 3. 100 divided by 10 is 10. So in lowest terms, it's 3/10. So 30% is equivalent to 30 100ths, and it's also equivalent to 3/10. How about 25%? What would that ratio be in fraction form? Well, it's 25 100ths. But that's not in lowest terms yet, is it? What will it be in lowest terms? Well, we can divide both 25 and 100 by 25, and that gives us 1/4. 25% and 1/4 are equivalent. Next, let's look at 75%. The ratio form is going to be 75 100ths, which in lowest terms will be what? Well, both 75 and 100 can be divided by 25. 75 divided by 25 is 3. 100 divided by 25 is 4, so that's 3/4. All right, this is a good one to know. 75% is equivalent to 3/4. Next, we have 20%. What will the ratio form be? It's going to be 20 100ths. And since 20 and 100 can both be divided by 20, we know it's not in lowest terms yet. 20 divided by 20 is 1. 100 divided by 20 is 5. So in lowest terms, it's 1/5. How about 60%? It's going to be 60 100ths. That's not in lowest terms though, is it? 60 and 100 are both multiples of 10, so they can both be divided by 10. But you know, they can also both be divided by 20. 20 is the greatest common factor here. So 60 divided by 20 is 3. And 100 divided by 20 is 5. So 60% is equivalent to 3/5. Now, what is the ratio for 100%? What is the ratio for 100%? Well, 100% is the same as 100 100ths, or 1 whole. So, if 100% of the students had chosen soccer as their favorite sport, then that would have meant the whole group would have chosen soccer. If 100% of a family goes for a bike ride, that means the whole family went for a bike ride. So always remember that 100% means the whole thing. Let's see how you're doing with percents so far. Number 1, you needed to change this ratio to a percent. 40 100ths equals 40%. Number 3, 25 to 100 is 25%. Number 5, 39 to 100 is 39%. This time you have a percent, you need to write in as a ratio in fraction form with 100 as the denominator. So for number 7, 15% equals 15 100ths. Number 9, 9% equals 9 100ths. 11, 12% equals 12 100ths. Number 13, 26% equals 26 100ths. Number 15, 48% equals 48 100ths. Number 27, this time you had to write the percent as a ratio in fraction form, but you also had to put it in lowest terms. So 10% is 10 100ths, which in lowest terms is 1/10. 29, you have 25%, that's 25 100ths. In lowest terms, that's 1/4. Then number 31, you have 40%, that's 40 100ths, and in lowest terms, it's 2/5. Now let's take a look at a word problem next. It says 3 out of 10 members in the club like rugby. What percent of the members like rugby? Now first, what is the ratio of members in the club that like rugby? Well, that ratio is 3 to 10. And how many members in the club make up the whole club, or 100% of the club? That's 10 members. So there are 10 members in the club, so that's 100% of it. Now, one way to find the percent that's equal to a given ratio or fraction is to set up a proportion like this. Since we know that 3 of the 10 members like rugby, and we know that 100% of the club is equal to 10 members, we can complete this proportion to find the percent of the members that like rugby. Remember, when we're finding equivalent ratios, we have to multiply both terms by the same number. So, what do we multiply 10 by to get 100? Multiply it by 10. So, what percent of the club members like rugby? It's 30%. But how do we figure that out? Well, if we multiply 10 by 10 to get 100, we have to also multiply 3 by 10, which is 30. And 30 out of 100 is 30%. So you see what we did there? When we set up the proportion, it had to be, the second term had to be 100, because if we're going to look for a percent, we need to have a ratio that has 100 as the second term. Now, what if we have the ratio 35 to 50? Or since this is in fraction form, we can say 35 50ths. How can we figure out what that is as a percent? Well, we can do that by setting up a proportion. We know that a percent as a ratio has 100 as the second term, so we'll put n to 100 as our equivalent ratio to set up our proportion. Now we know that 50 times 2 will give us 100, so we also need to multiply 35 times 2. And what does that equal? That's 70. So the ratio 70 100ths is equivalent to 35 50ths. And 70 100ths tells us that the percent we're looking for is 70%. So our original ratio, 35 to 50, is equivalent to 70%. Next, we have the ratio 11 to 20. Let's write that ratio as a percent. So we're going to set up a proportion. Right, so we have n to 100. We have to multiply 20 times 5 to get 100. So we also need to multiply 11 times 5. And what does that equal? It equals 55. So that ratio is 55 to 100, and that is 55%. So 11 20ths, or 11 to 20, is the same as 55%. Now what if we have the ratio 1 to 2? That's 1/2. Let's set up a proportion so we can find the percent. And what are we going to put to write the proportion? What is our equivalent ratio going to look like right now? We're going to put n to 100. We need to have 100 in that second term. Why? Because that's how we're going to find the percent. It's got to be something out of 100 in order to find the percent. All right, so 2 times 50 equals 100. So that means we need to multiply that 1 times 50 as well. 1 times 50 is 50. So the ratio 50 to 100 is equivalent to 1 to 2. And 50 to 100 tells us that the percent is 50%. So 1/2 equals 50%. That's a good one for you to know off the top of your head. It's good for you to know that 50% and half are equivalent. Next we have 12/25, or 12 to 25. Let's set up a proportion so we can find the percent. So we're going to put equals n to 100. We need 100 in that second term. 25 times what gives us 100? 25 times 4. So we also need to multiply 12 times 4, and that is 48. So the equivalent ratio is 48/100. So what percent is that? 48%. 48% equals 12 to 25, or 12/25. One more. 3/4, or 3 to 4. Here's our proportion, with 100 as the second term. And 4 times 25 gives us 100, so we also need to multiply 3 times 25, which is what? That's 75. So the ratio 75 to 100 is equivalent to 3 to 4. Or we could say it like a fraction. We could say 3/4 and 75/100 are equivalent. So that percent is 75%. It's another good one for you to know off the top of your head. 3/4 is the same as 75%. So that's how to find a percent from a ratio.